The morning air was thick with tension as J.D. Vance walked up the stone steps of the federal courthouse. Camera crews lined both sides of the walkway, their lenses tracking his every move. The senator's footsteps echoed in the marble hallway as he made his way to courtroom 4B, where his fate would be decided. Inside the packed courtroom, every seat was filled. Reporters scribbled notes furiously while spectators whispered among themselves. The atmosphere felt electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Vance took his place at the defendant's table, straightening his tie and glancing briefly at the crowd behind him. Judge Harrison Maxwell entered through the side door, his black robes flowing as he climbed to his elevated bench. At 68 years old, Maxwell had earned a reputation as one of the toughest judges in the federal system. His gray hair was perfectly combed, and his steel blue eyes seemed to pierce through anyone who dared challenge his authority. The courtroom fell silent as he settled into his chair. "Be seated," Maxwell commanded, his voice booming across the room. "We are here today regarding the matter of contempt charges against Senator Vance." The case had begun 3 weeks earlier, when Vance received a stack of classified documents through his role on the Senate Intelligence Committee. These papers contained explosive information about government surveillance programs that had been secretly expanded without proper congressional oversight. The documents revealed that federal agencies had been collecting data on American citizens far beyond what was legally authorized. Vance knew immediately that the public needed to see these documents. The Constitution gave Congress the power to oversee the executive branch, and these papers showed clear violations of that principle. But when he tried to discuss the findings publicly, the Department of Justice moved quickly to silence him. They obtained a gag order from Judge Maxwell, claiming that any public discussion of the classified materials would harm national security. The order was broad and sweeping, preventing Vance from even mentioning that such documents existed. It was the kind of legal maneuver that happened behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny. But Vance refused to stay quiet. He believed the American people had a right to know when their government was overstepping its bounds. He held a press conference on the Capitol steps, speaking carefully but clearly about government overreach and the need for transparency. He didn't reveal specific details from the classified documents, but he made it clear that serious constitutional violations were taking place. The next morning, contempt charges were filed against him. Now, 3 weeks later, he sat in Maxwell's courtroom facing the possibility of imprisonment. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s, stood to address the judge. "Your Honor," she began, "Senator Vance willfully violated your gag order. His press conference was a direct challenge to this court's authority and potentially compromised national security. The government requests that he be held in contempt and sentenced immediately." Judge Maxwell nodded slowly, then turned his attention to Vance. "Senator, you were explicitly ordered not to discuss matters related to the classified documents in question, yet you held a public press conference. How do you respond to these charges?" Vance rose from his chair, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, knowing that his words could either save his career or destroy it. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice clear and unwavering, "I took an oath when I became a senator. That oath was not to any judge or court, but to the Constitution of the United States. The documents I reviewed show clear violations of constitutional principles and congressional oversight responsibilities." Maxwell's expression darkened. "Senator, this court is not interested in your political opinions. You violated a direct order. With respect, Your Honor, this isn't about politics. This is about the separation of powers that our founders built into our system of government. Congress has a constitutional duty to oversee the executive branch. When that oversight reveals wrongdoing, we have an obligation to the American people." The tension in the room was palpable. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. Vance continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The gag order prevents me from fulfilling my constitutional duties as a senator. It essentially allows the executive branch to hide potential crimes behind a judicial order. This violates the very foundation of our democratic system." Judge Maxwell's face reddened. He had never had a defendant speak to him this way, especially not in open court with cameras rolling. "Senator Vance, you seem to misunderstand your position here. You are not above the law, regardless of your title. This court issued a lawful order and you chose to ignore it. Your Honor, I understand the seriousness of this situation, but I cannot, in good conscience, allow potential constitutional violations to remain hidden from the American people. My oath to the Constitution supersedes any other consideration." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Several people in the gallery nodded in agreement, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Judge Maxwell slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding, "Order." "Senator Vance," Maxwell said, his voice ice-cold, "your defiance of this court's authority is contemptible. The law applies to everyone, including elected officials who think they know better than federal judges." Vance remained standing, his posture straight and dignified. "Your Honor, I'm not claiming to be above the law. I'm arguing that the Constitution is the highest law in our land, and when lower laws conflict with constitutional principles, we have a duty to uphold the Constitution." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This wasn't going according to plan. Instead of a simple contempt hearing, they were now in the middle of a constitutional debate being broadcast live to the nation. Maxwell leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Senator, your constitutional theories are irrelevant here. You violated a court order. That is contempt, plain and simple. Do you intend to comply with this court's gag order going forward?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Everyone in the courtroom understood that Vance's answer would determine his immediate future. If he agreed to comply, he would walk free, but remain silenced. If he refused, he would face imprisonment. Vance looked around the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting those of his supporters in the gallery. He thought about the classified documents sitting in his Senate office and the constitutional violations they revealed. He thought about his oath of office and his responsibility to the people who elected him. "Your Honor," he said finally, "I cannot and will not comply with an order that prevents me from fulfilling my constitutional duties to the American people. The separation of powers is not a suggestion. It's the foundation of our democracy." The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Maxwell's face turned deep red with anger. He had expected Vance to back down when faced with the reality of imprisonment. Instead, the senator had doubled down on his defiance. "Very well, Senator," Maxwell said, his voice barely containing his rage. "You have chosen to place yourself in contempt of this court. I hereby order your immediate imprisonment until you agree to comply with this court's lawful orders." The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Cameras flashed as federal marshals stepped forward, ready to escort Vance away. But the senator remained calm, his dignity intact even as his freedom was being taken away. This was just the beginning of a battle that would reshape American politics and test the very foundations of constitutional government. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Maxwell's words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that everyone could smell but nobody wanted to acknowledge. Federal marshals stood at attention, waiting for their orders while reporters frantically typed on their phones, trying to be the first to break the news. Vance remained perfectly still at the defendant's table. His lawyer, a seasoned attorney who had handled dozens of high-profile cases, leaned over and whispered urgently in his ear. But Vance gently shook his head. He had made his decision long before entering this courtroom, and nothing would change his mind now. "Senator Vance," Judge Maxwell said, his voice cutting through the tension, "I'm giving you one final opportunity to reconsider. Simply agree to comply with this court's gag order, and you can walk out of here a free man. Continue this foolish defiance and you will be taken into federal custody immediately." The offer was tempting. Everyone in the room could see it. The chance to avoid imprisonment, to return to his family, to continue his work in the Senate. All he had to do was promise to stay quiet about the classified documents that revealed government overreach. It would be so easy to just nod and walk away. But Vance thought about the stack of papers sitting in his secure office on Capitol Hill. Those documents showed how federal agencies had been secretly collecting phone records, emails, and internet activity from millions of Americans without proper warrants. They revealed programs that operated in the shadows, violating the Fourth Amendment on a massive scale. The surveillance wasn't targeting terrorists or foreign enemies. It was collecting data on teachers, small business owners, college students, and grandparents. Regular Americans who had never committed any crime were having their most private communications monitored and stored in government databases. Even worse, the documents showed that when members of Congress had asked questions about these programs, they had been lied to. Agency directors had testified under oath that no such broad surveillance was taking place. They had looked senators and representatives in the eye and deliberately misled them. Vance knew that if he stayed silent now, these violations would continue. More Americans would have their privacy invaded. More lies would be told to Congress. The Constitution would become nothing more than a piece of paper gathering dust in the National Archives. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed courtroom. Every eye was fixed on him as he straightened his jacket and looked directly at Judge Maxwell. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I appreciate your offer, but I cannot accept it. The American people elected me to be their voice in Washington, not to be silenced by judicial orders that protect government wrongdoing." A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Several spectators shook their heads in disbelief while others nodded with obvious admiration. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word for history. Judge Maxwell's face turned an even deeper shade of red. In 30 years on the federal bench, he had never encountered such open defiance. Most defendants, especially prominent politicians, would do anything to avoid imprisonment. They would apologize, make excuses, or find some way to back down gracefully. But Vance was different. "Very well," Maxwell said through gritted teeth. "Marshal Rodriguez, please take Senator Vance into custody." The lead marshal, a professional woman in her mid-40s with 20 years of federal law enforcement experience, stepped forward hesitantly. She had escorted countless defendants from courtrooms over the years, but never a sitting United States senator. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. As she reached for her handcuffs, Vance raised his hand gently. "Marshal, if I may, I'd like to say something to the court before you proceed." Judge Maxwell looked like he wanted to refuse, but the cameras were rolling and the entire nation was watching. Denying a senator his final words would look petty and vindictive. He nodded curtly. Vance turned to face the packed gallery, his eyes sweeping across the faces of reporters, supporters, critics, and curious observers who had packed every available seat. Outside the courtroom, he could hear the growing crowd of protesters and supporters gathering on the courthouse steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "what happens here today is bigger than one senator or one judge. This is about whether our government will be transparent to the people it serves, or whether it will operate in the shadows while hiding behind judicial orders." His words were measured and deliberate. He wasn't giving a campaign speech or trying to score political points. He was speaking from his heart about principles that had guided his entire career in public service. "The documents I've seen reveal systematic violations of our constitutional rights. They show government agencies collecting our most private information without warrants, without oversight, and without the knowledge of the very Congress that's supposed to supervise them. When I tried to bring these violations to light, I was silenced with a gag order. The courtroom was absolutely still. Even Judge Maxwell, despite his anger, found himself listening intently to every word. I understand that some people believe I should simply comply with the court's order and keep quiet. They think that following orders, even questionable ones, is more important than protecting constitutional rights. I respectfully disagree." Vance paused, letting his words sink in. He could see people in the gallery leaning forward, hanging on every syllable. Throughout our history, Americans have stood up to authority when that authority overstepped its bounds. They didn't do it because it was easy or comfortable. They did it because some principles are worth defending, even at great personal cost. His voice grew stronger as he continued. "The founders of our nation risked everything, their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, to establish a system where government power would be limited and accountable. They created checks and balances specifically to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. Several people in the gallery began nodding appreciatively. Even some who had come to criticize Vance found themselves moved by his words. Today I face imprisonment not because I committed any crime, but because I refused to stay silent about government overreach. I'm being punished for trying to fulfill my oath of office and my duty to the American people. Judge Maxwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was beginning to realize that Vance was turning his contempt hearing into a constitutional convention, broadcast live to millions of Americans. I want to be clear about something, Vance continued. I have great respect for our judicial system and for the rule of law. But the rule of law means that everyone, including judges and government officials, must follow the Constitution. When lower laws conflict with constitutional principles, the Constitution must prevail. The marshal stood patiently beside him, her handcuffs ready but not yet applied. She had never experienced anything like this in her career. So I go to prison today not as a criminal, but as someone who believes that government transparency is essential to our democracy. I go knowing that my imprisonment will shine a bright light on the very issues they're trying to keep hidden. He turned back to Judge Maxwell one final time. Your Honor, I'm ready. The marshal gently placed the handcuffs on Vance's wrists as cameras flashed throughout the courtroom. But instead of looking defeated, Vance stood tall and proud. He had made his choice, and he was at peace with the consequences. As he was led, from the courtroom, the gallery erupted in both cheers and boos. Outside, the crowd had grown to over 1,000 people, and their chants could be heard through the thick courthouse walls. History was being made, and everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The news spread like wildfire across the country. Within minutes of Vance being led away in handcuffs, video clips of his courtroom speech were flooding social media platforms. The footage showed him standing tall and dignified as he spoke about constitutional principles, then calmly accepting imprisonment rather than backing down from his beliefs. At a coffee shop in downtown Denver, customers gathered around the television screen mounted on the wall. The morning rush had come to a complete stop as people watched the breaking news coverage. A construction worker in paint-stained clothes set down his coffee cup and shook his head in amazement. I can't believe they actually arrested a senator, he said to nobody in particular, for trying to tell us what our own government is doing to us. An elderly woman at a nearby table looked up from her newspaper. My husband fought in Korea, she said quietly. He always told me that the moment we stop questioning our government is the moment we stop being free. Similar conversations were happening in diners, barbershops, grocery stores, and workplaces across America. The image of Vance in handcuffs had struck a nerve that went beyond party politics. People from all walks of life were asking the same questions. If a senator could be imprisoned for trying to expose government overreach, what did that mean for ordinary citizens? On social media, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The hashtag #BornFreeVance began trending within an hour of his arrest. But it wasn't just his political supporters who were sharing the videos and expressing outrage. Democrats, Republicans, and independents were all posting about the importance of government transparency and constitutional rights. A retired teacher from Iowa posted a video that quickly went viral. Speaking directly to her phone camera while sitting in her kitchen, she explained why Vance's imprisonment concerned her, even though she had never voted for him. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. What happened in that courtroom today should scare every American. They arrested a senator for trying to tell us the truth about our own government. If they can silence him, they can silence any of us. Her video was shared thousands of times within hours, with people adding their own comments about government accountability and the right to know what their elected officials were doing. Meanwhile, outside the federal courthouse where Vance had been arrested, the crowd continued to grow. What had started as a few dozen supporters and protesters had swelled to over 2,000 people by mid-afternoon. They came from all backgrounds: college students, retirees, small business owners, teachers, veterans, and working parents who had taken time off to make their voices heard. The demonstration was remarkably peaceful. People held homemade signs with messages like "Transparency Now," "Defend the Constitution," and government of the people, by the people, for the people. Some carried American flags, while others simply stood silently in solidarity. A young mother holding her toddler's hand explained to a reporter why she had driven 3 hours to be there. "My daughter is going to grow up in this country," she said. "I want her to live in a place where the government can't hide its actions from the people. If we don't stand up now, what kind of America will we leave for our children?" The scene was being repeated in cities across the nation. In Phoenix, over 1,000 people gathered at the state capitol building. In Atlanta, protesters filled the steps of the federal courthouse. In Seattle, a candlelight vigil drew hundreds of participants who stood in the rain to show their support for government transparency. What made these demonstrations unique was their bipartisan nature. At the Phoenix rally, a retired Republican county commissioner stood next to a young Democratic activist, both holding signs demanding government accountability. In Atlanta, veterans from different wars and different political parties shared stories about why they had served their country and what freedom meant to them. The mainstream media initially struggled to categorize the movement. Political commentators tried to frame it as either liberal or conservative, but the reality on the ground was more complex. This wasn't about traditional left versus right politics. It was about a fundamental question that transcended party lines. Should the American people have the right to know what their government is doing in their name? News networks began sending their top anchors to cover the story. Instead of the usual partisan talking heads, they found themselves interviewing ordinary Americans who were genuinely concerned about constitutional principles. A truck driver from Ohio summed up the feelings of many when he told a national television audience, "I don't know much about politics, but I know right from wrong, and it's wrong to arrest someone for trying to tell the truth. My granddad always said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Maybe it's time to let some sunlight into these government offices." Social media platforms saw unprecedented engagement around the story. Videos of Vance's speech were shared millions of times, often accompanied by personal stories from Americans who felt their government had become too secretive and powerful. A hashtag called Der Isn't Sunlight Government began trending alongside Der Free Vance, as people shared examples of government secrecy that concerned them. The response wasn't limited to protests and social media posts. Within hours of Vance's imprisonment, donations began pouring into civil liberties organizations. The American Civil Liberties Union reported receiving more online donations in a single day than they typically received in a month. Similar organizations, focused on government transparency and constitutional rights, saw their websites crash from the volume of traffic and donation attempts. Legal scholars across the country began weighing in on the constitutional issues raised by Vance's case. Law professors who rarely agreed on anything found themselves united in their concern about the use of gag orders to prevent elected officials from discussing government oversight issues with their constituents. A constitutional law professor at a prestigious university appeared on the evening news to explain the broader implications. "What we're seeing here is a fundamental question about the separation of powers," she said. "Congress has a constitutional duty to oversee the executive branch. When the judicial branch prevents that oversight through gag orders, it upsets the entire balance of our system." Even some judges began expressing concerns privately. A retired federal judge who had served for 25 years told colleagues that he had never seen a case quite like this one. The intersection of congressional oversight, executive secrecy, and judicial authority was creating a constitutional crisis that legal textbooks had never fully addressed. By evening, the story had gone international. News outlets in London, Paris, and Tokyo were covering the American senator who had chosen imprisonment over silence. Foreign commentators noted that the United States had often criticized other countries for imprisoning political figures who challenged government secrecy. Now America was facing its own test of those principles. The growing movement began to attract support from unexpected quarters. Business leaders who rarely involved themselves in political controversies issued statements supporting government transparency. A group of Fortune 500 CEOs signed a letter arguing that democratic accountability was essential for economic stability and investor confidence. Religious leaders from various faiths also began speaking out. They focused not on the political aspects of the case, but on the moral principles involved. A prominent pastor in Texas told his congregation that speaking truth to power was a fundamental Christian duty, regardless of the personal cost. As the sun set on that historic day, it was clear that something had changed in America. What had started as a legal dispute between a senator and a judge had become a national conversation about democracy, transparency, and the rights of citizens to know what their government was doing. The movement was still growing, and nobody knew where it would lead. But one thing was certain: Americans were no longer willing to accept government secrecy without question. They wanted answers, and they were willing to stand up and demand them. The federal detention center where Vance spent his first night was nothing like the comfortable offices of the Capitol building. His cell was small and sterile, with concrete walls painted an institutional beige color. A narrow window near the ceiling allowed just enough light to see the bars that separated him from the outside world. But despite the uncomfortable surroundings, Vance felt strangely at peace. He had made his choice based on principle, and he was prepared to face the consequences. As he lay on the thin mattress, listening to the sounds of the detention facility around him, he thought about the classified documents that had started this whole ordeal. Those papers contained more than just evidence of surveillance programs. They showed a pattern of deception that went to the very heart of American democracy. When Congress had held hearings about government surveillance, agency directors had looked legislators in the eye and denied the existence of programs that the documents proved were real and extensive. The lies weren't small or technical. They were fundamental misrepresentations about how the government was treating its own citizens. If senators and representatives couldn't get honest answers about basic constitutional issues, how could they provide proper oversight? How could they represent their constituents effectively? While Vance contemplated these questions in his cell, the legal and political machinery of Washington was working overtime. His arrest had created exactly the kind of constitutional crisis that the founders had tried to prevent when they designed the system of checks and balances. At the Supreme Court building, clerks were working through the night to prepare briefs for an emergency session. The 9 justices had been contacted at their homes and asked to consider an unprecedented situation. Never before had a sitting senator been imprisoned for contempt related to his congressional oversight duties. The Attorney General found herself in an impossible position. As the nation's top law enforcement officer, she was supposed to support federal judges and their orders. But as a constitutional scholar who had spent years studying separation of powers issues, she understood that Judge Maxwell's gag order raised serious questions about congressional authority. Late that evening, she placed a secure phone call to the White House. The conversation was brief but intense. The president was facing enormous pressure from multiple directions. Congressional leaders from both parties were demanding answers. Foreign allies were asking questions about American democratic institutions. And the protests in major cities showed no signs of slowing down. "This is bigger than one senator or one case," the Attorney General explained during the call. "We're looking at a fundamental conflict between the 3 branches of government. If we don't handle this carefully, it could undermine confidence in our entire system." Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, senators and representatives were grappling with questions they had never faced before. If one of their colleagues could be imprisoned for trying to discuss government oversight issues, what did that mean for their own ability to do their jobs? The Senate Majority Leader called an emergency meeting of the leadership from both parties. The conference room was tense as senators who rarely agreed on anything found themselves united in their concern about congressional prerogatives. "This isn't about whether you like Vance or agree with his politics," the Majority Leader said to the assembled group. "This is about whether Congress can function as an independent branch of government. If judges can silence us with gag orders whenever we try to discuss oversight issues, then we've lost one of our most important constitutional powers." The Minority Leader, who had often clashed with Vance on policy issues, found herself nodding in agreement. "I never thought I'd be defending him," she admitted. "But the principle here is bigger than any individual. We either have the right to conduct oversight and inform our constituents, or we don't." Similar conversations were happening in the House of Representatives. The speaker called an unusual joint session where members from both parties could discuss the constitutional implications of Vance's imprisonment. The debate was heated but largely bipartisan, with representatives focusing on institutional powers rather than partisan politics. 3 state governors took the extraordinary step of issuing a joint statement that evening. The governors of Texas, Wisconsin, and Colorado came from different political parties, but they shared a concern about federal overreach. Their statement was carefully worded, but unmistakably supportive of Vance's position. The federal government's use of gag orders to prevent elected officials from discussing oversight issues with their constituents represents a dangerous expansion of judicial power, the statement read. We call on the Supreme Court to act quickly to restore the proper balance between the branches of government. Legal scholars across the country were burning the midnight oil, writing analyses and briefs about the case. The situation was unprecedented in modern American history, and constitutional experts were scrambling to find historical precedents that might guide the Supreme Court's decision. A professor at Harvard Law School, who had written extensively about congressional powers, published an emergency analysis that quickly circulated among legal circles. What we're witnessing, she wrote, is the collision of 3 fundamental principles: judicial authority to enforce contempt orders, congressional power to conduct oversight, and the public's right to know about government activities. The resolution of this conflict will shape American democracy for generations. The pressure on the Supreme Court was enormous. Protesters had gathered outside the court building, holding signs and chanting slogans about constitutional rights. Inside, the justices were reviewing briefs and precedents, trying to find a path through the legal and political minefield. The Chief Justice had served on the court for over a decade, but he had never faced a case with such immediate constitutional implications. The court's decision wouldn't just affect Vance's freedom, it would determine the balance of power between the 3 branches of government for years to come. International observers were watching closely as well. America's allies and competitors alike were interested in how the world's oldest constitutional democracy would handle this crisis. The outcome would send a message about American commitment to democratic principles and the rule of law. In newsrooms across the country, editors were struggling to keep up with the rapidly developing story. What had started as a legal dispute was becoming a national civics lesson, with Americans getting a crash course in constitutional law and the separation of powers. The evening news broadcasts led with the story, showing footage of the growing protests alongside interviews with constitutional experts. The anchors tried to explain the complex legal issues in simple terms, helping viewers understand why a single contempt case had become a national crisis. Social media platforms continued to buzz with discussion about the case. The hashtags #KeerFreeVance and constitutional crisis were trending worldwide, with millions of posts analyzing every aspect of the situation. Americans were engaging with constitutional questions in ways that hadn't been seen since the founding era. Religious leaders across the country were being asked to comment on the moral dimensions of the case. Many focused on the ethical obligation to resist unjust laws, drawing parallels to historical examples of civil disobedience. Their statements added another layer to the national conversation about when individuals should resist government authority. Business groups were also weighing in, arguing that democratic accountability was essential for economic stability. A coalition of major corporations issued a statement supporting government transparency, noting that investor confidence depended on knowing that government institutions were functioning properly. As Vance's first night in detention came to an end, it was clear that his imprisonment had triggered something much larger than anyone had anticipated. The American people were engaged in a fundamental debate about democracy, transparency, and the balance of power in their government. The Supreme Court had agreed to hear emergency arguments the next morning, setting up a legal showdown that would determine not just Vance's fate, but the future relationship between Congress, the courts, and the American people. The entire nation was waiting to see how the crisis would be resolved. The Supreme Court building had never seen anything quite like this. By 7 in the morning, thousands of people had gathered on the steps and surrounding streets, creating a sea of American flags, homemade signs, and anxious faces. Police barriers kept the crowd organized, but the energy was electric. Everyone knew they were about to witness a historic moment. Inside the marble halls of the court, the 9 justices were preparing for one of the most important hearings in decades. They had spent the entire night reviewing briefs, studying precedents, and discussing the constitutional principles at stake. The Chief Justice had called for the emergency session to begin at 9 o'clock sharp. Meanwhile, at the federal detention center, Vance was getting ready for what could be his final day in custody. He had slept surprisingly well despite the uncomfortable surroundings. A guard brought him a simple breakfast and informed him that his lawyer would be arriving soon to escort him to the court. The attorney who represented Vance was one of the most respected constitutional lawyers in the country. She had argued dozens of cases before the Supreme Court and had never faced anything quite like this. As she reviewed her notes one final time, she knew that her arguments could determine the balance of power in American government for generations to come. At exactly 9 o'clock, the Chief Justice called the court to order. The packed courtroom fell silent as he began to speak. Representatives from all 3 branches of government were present, along with legal scholars, journalists, and citizens who had won the lottery for public seating. "We are here today," the Chief Justice announced, "to consider one of the most fundamental questions in American constitutional law, the relationship between congressional oversight powers and judicial authority. This case requires us to examine the very foundations of our system of checks and balances." Vance's lawyer stepped to the podium first. Her argument was clear and straightforward. Congress had a constitutional duty to oversee the executive branch, and judicial gag orders could not be used to prevent that oversight. She spoke about the separation of powers, the importance of government transparency, and the rights of elected officials to communicate with their constituents. "Your Honors," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "if we allow judicial orders to silence congressional oversight, we fundamentally alter the balance of power that the founders established. Congress cannot fulfill its constitutional role if it cannot discuss government wrongdoing with the American people." The government's attorney presented the opposing view, arguing that national security concerns sometimes required secrecy and that judges had the authority to issue gag orders when necessary. But as she spoke, it became clear that several justices were skeptical of her arguments. Justice after justice asked pointed questions about the scope of judicial power and the limits of congressional authority. The newest justice, known for her strict interpretation of constitutional text, asked whether the founders would have intended for judges to silence elected representatives. The most senior justice, who had served on the court for over 20 years, focused on the practical implications. "If we uphold this gag order," he asked, "what prevents judges from silencing any congressional discussion they find inconvenient? Where do we draw the line?" After 2 hours of intense questioning and argument, the justices retired to their conference room for deliberation. The crowd outside waited anxiously, knowing that American democracy hung in the balance. News networks provided live coverage, with constitutional experts trying to read the tea leaves from the justices' questions. Inside the conference room, the debate was intense, but surprisingly brief. Justice after justice spoke about the fundamental principles at stake. The vote, when it came, was unanimous, something that rarely happened in such controversial cases. The Chief Justice returned to the courtroom at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The packed chamber was so quiet that the sound of footsteps echoed off the marble walls. Cameras from around the world focused on his face as he prepared to announce the decision that would reshape American government. "In the matter of Vance versus the United States," he began, his voice strong and clear. "This court finds that the contempt order issued by Judge Maxwell exceeded judicial authority and violated the separation of powers established by the Constitution." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. The Chief Justice raised his hand for silence and continued reading the court's opinion. "Congress has both the constitutional authority and the obligation to conduct oversight of the executive branch. This oversight necessarily includes the right to discuss findings with constituents, subject only to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. Judicial gag orders that prevent such discussion violate the fundamental principle of legislative independence." The decision was even stronger than Vance's supporters had hoped. The court didn't just free him from prison, it established clear precedents protecting congressional oversight powers from judicial interference. Furthermore, the Chief Justice continued, we find that the classified documents in question reveal potential constitutional violations that Congress has not only the right but the duty to investigate and, where appropriate, to discuss publicly. Government secrecy cannot be used to hide evidence of wrongdoing from the people's elected representatives. Within minutes of the decision, news alerts were buzzing on phones across America. The crowds outside the Supreme Court began cheering and celebrating. At the Federal Detention Center, guards were already preparing release paperwork for Vance, but the real celebration was happening in the streets of America. In cities and towns across the country, people who had been following the case gathered to watch the news coverage. The retired teacher from Iowa who had posted the viral video was in tears as she watched the Supreme Court announcement on her kitchen television. This is what America is supposed to be, she said to her husband. A place where people can stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. The construction worker who had been watching the news in that Denver coffee shop 3 days earlier was there again, this time surrounded by co-workers who had come to see the Supreme Court decision. When the Chief Justice finished reading the opinion, the entire coffee shop broke into spontaneous applause. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Vance walked out of the Federal Detention Center a free man. But more than that, he walked out as a symbol of principled resistance to government overreach. Hundreds of supporters had gathered outside the facility, cheering and waving American flags as he emerged. The senator looked tired, but dignified as he approached the microphones that had been set up for his statement. The crowd fell silent, waiting to hear from the man who had risked everything for constitutional principles. 3 days ago, he began, I was imprisoned for trying to tell the American people the truth about their government. Today, the Supreme Court has affirmed that in America, truth and transparency must prevail over secrecy and power. His words were measured and humble, focusing not on his personal vindication, but on the broader principles at stake. This case was never about me, he continued. It was about whether our democracy can survive when government operates in darkness, hiding its actions from the very people it serves. The impact of the Supreme Court decision extended far beyond Vance's freedom. Within hours, congressional committees announced new investigations into government surveillance programs. The classified documents that had started the whole controversy were declassified and released to the public, revealing the full extent of unconstitutional surveillance activities. The revelations shocked the nation. The documents showed that millions of Americans had been subject to warrantless surveillance, that Congress had been systematically lied to about these programs, and that government agencies had operated with virtually no oversight for years. But, perhaps more importantly, the case had awakened something in the American people. Citizens who had become cynical about politics were suddenly engaged in discussions about constitutional principles. Voter registration increased dramatically as people realized that their voices mattered in holding government accountable. The 3 governors who had supported Vance found their approval ratings soaring. The bipartisan nature of the support for his transparency had created new political coalitions that crossed traditional party lines. Politicians from both parties began embracing government accountability as a winning issue. Judge Maxwell, whose contempt order had started the crisis, quietly announced his retirement from the federal bench. Legal scholars noted that his overreach had ultimately strengthened congressional powers and government transparency. In the months that followed, Congress passed sweeping reforms to government surveillance programs. New oversight mechanisms were established, and strict limits were placed on the use of classified information to hide potential wrongdoing from elected representatives. Vance returned to the Senate as something he had never been before, a genuine hero to millions of Americans who valued constitutional principles over partisan politics. His approval ratings crossed party lines, with even former critics acknowledging his courage in standing up for democratic values. The story became a defining moment in American history. Taught in civics classes as an example,